Okay. We are in the middle of Romans chapter 9, and I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to make our way into chapter 10 as we follow his train of thought here. There are some things, though, we want to make sure that we do discuss as we're going through this. First of all, we finished up last week making a comparison between an individual in the Old Testament and Israel as a nation. Anybody remember what that comparison was? What's that? All right, the Pharaoh. Remember the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And so you have the Pharaoh over here. Tell me about him. What did God do? Okay, God raised him up, gave him all kinds of blessing so that he could what? Okay, so that he could be brought down, and in the bringing down, he was there for a specific purpose. What was that purpose? Okay, it showed God's power, yes. Okay, it demonstrated his name among the nations. More practical. Israel is saved, right? Through Pharaoh, through God's demonstration over Pharaoh, God's people are what? They're saved, but be more specific. Free from what? All right, freed from slavery, right? God's people are freed from slavery. All right, my kerning's a little messed up here. It looks like F-ROM. Remember, I'm at the bottom of the board. Get to the bottom of the board, the handwriting really goes downhill. No pun intended. But you get God's people are freed from slavery. And very specifically, the Pharaoh had to be raised up so that he could be brought down, so that God's people, I put it here, are they God's people at this point when the Pharaoh is raised up? No, they don't become a people until when? Until they get to Sinai. So it's after all of the events that take place that they become God's people. So in essence, these are not a people that are not connected to him, that he then calls to be his people, brings into a covenant relationship with him after bringing them out of slavery. That's the picture of the Pharaoh. What does that have to do with Israel? Okay, is it possible, Paul says, that God used Israel in the same way? Remember, he's been dealing with this question throughout, and he deals with it in Galatians as well. This objection that says, hey, Paul, you're obviously wrong about God and Israel and the law, because look at how God has protected, taken care of, brought Israel along, and made them his special people, and they've been his special people for all this time. Why would he do that just to boot them off at the end? They say, Paul, you don't make any sense. That's a problem. And what does Paul say about Israel here when you get down to verse 22? Romans chapter 9, verse 22. What does he say? Okay. Julia said that he basically calls Israel vessels of wrath, prepared for destruction. And what does he say? That God has been what? Long-suffering. He has been patient with them. What if he raised up Israel and has kept them in this place over this long period of time as the story, the narrative has been unfolding until he gets to the point that the Messiah comes. And when the Messiah comes, what does the Messiah do? Frees everybody from slavery, right? He kind of does so and demonstrates the power to free everyone from slavery, kind of over whom? Who was it that's really responsible for the Messiah being put on the cross? Is it not Israel herself, right? So Israel are the ones who reject Jesus, who reject the Messiah when the Messiah comes, and ultimately it is that very rejection of the Messiah that is the cause for freeing God's people from slavery. And in the midst of that, they reject the Messiah, which brings about now their downfall as a whole, right? We're talking about Israel, just generally speaking, as a whole. As they reject the Messiah, what does this open up? A path for whom? A path for the Gentiles. And so now, because of Israel, you now have I don't know how I want to draw it on the board. There's now a path for the Gentiles, right? And so now the Gentiles, who are God's people, freed from slavery, who were not a people before but are now brought into a covenant relationship, it is the Gentiles, right? And that's when you move on into verse 23. What if God, desiring to show his wrath, to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to what? In the text, it's right there. In order to, okay, make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. All right, so the Jews are a given, by the way. As far as God's people are concerned, the Jews are a given. And we're going to talk about this idea in just a couple minutes. But what I want to just very, very quickly look at, as he has now created this idea, and by the way, what does he quote here? Those who were not my people, I will call my people. Who's that? Hosea, yeah. Who are the not my people? Okay, he's very specifically saying this should not be surprising that the Gentiles now are a large part of what's going on right here. And so, verse 24, very clearly he is saying that this pathway has now been opened up to the Gentiles without reference to Israel. Or without reference to what? That's connected to Israel? All right, without reference to the law of Moses, right? There's no connection to the law of Moses and the Gentiles being freed from slavery. Now, I want to back up just a little bit. What is the illustration that he uses if Israel may say, that's not fair, God, you're not allowed to do that? All right, yeah, Cliff said the potter, right? The illustration of the clay and the potter. Verse 19, you will say to me, why does he still find fault? Who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will that which is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use, another for dishonorable use? In all of their objections, where they're saying, Paul, you must be wrong because God would never do this, right? What they're saying is, if God does this, then God is not being fair. And Paul is saying, well, that's what God did, and you have no right to declare whether he is fair or not because of the way that he has used Israel in this way. And this, by the way, is an idea that they would have been on board with, generally speaking. This idea of a clay and the potter, where does that come from? Paul just kind of make this one up on the spot? Yeah, Karen? Okay, you can go all the way back. Karen said comes from Genesis. You can go all the way back, which I think has something to do with a lot of these analogies, particularly with idols and stuff like that, to where God made man from dust, right? But yeah, this analogy though, you can find it in various places throughout the prophets. And I'm just going to look Jeremiah chapter 18. In Jeremiah chapter 18, this is one of those things. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, these prophets. There's a lot of what's called object lessons, where he doesn't just say something, but there's some kind of an object involved, and he says, "All right, look at this, see this." And Jeremiah, has a few of these, and this is one where Jeremiah chapter 18, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, "Arise, go down to the potter's house. There I will let you hear my words." So it's not enough that Jeremiah just listens and God says, "Here's what I want you to know." He has to take a field trip, right? So he gets down to the potter's house, verse 3. "So I went to the potter's house, and he was working at his wheel, and the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand. So he reworked it into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to do. So the word of the Lord came to me, 'O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter has done, declares the Lord? Behold, like clay in the potter's hand, so you are in my hand, O house of Israel.'" And that's kind of the point, isn't it? That's exactly what he's saying. You are clay. I can mold you into what I want you to be, and then I can break that down and create something else. That's the prerogative of the potter. Does everybody understand that analogy as he's using it? And he's using an analogy that is clear within their scriptures, that everybody who's objecting to him would have understood. But remember, when he says that in Jeremiah, is God talking about Israel in Paul's day? No, this is a warning, right, of things that are coming, things that are pertinent in their day and time. But like so many things within the scriptures, you look at it and say, kind of works here too, doesn't it? And that's what Paul is doing, I think. That's what he's bringing out here by bringing that out in chapter 9 and then going straight into finishing up the comparison of the Pharaoh and the nation of Israel when he says, let's see here, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy and compassion on whom I have compassion. All right. Any questions on that before we go to like the next verse and the next big major discussion? All right, because in this next verse we have a word that's really not used very often in the New Testament. It's probably used somewhere. I'm trying to think of somewhere else besides Romans that it's actually used, but I'm sure someone will correct me on this. But it's not one of those themes that just runs throughout, but it is a big theme within the prophets. So, verse 27. Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only what? All right, only a remnant. Only a remnant will be saved. So, let's start talking about this idea. Now, I don't know. Is this a word that everybody uses in just normal language on a regular basis? There are some contexts by which you probably do. Kevin, do you? Okay. All right. So Kevin's talking about like in fabrication of some sort that you have a remnant that's left that you then apply to something else and use. You would say that. Yeah, Whitney? Okay, so there's a technical term in sewing then? When you have less than a yard, that's a okay, so if you have less than a yard in the bolt, that's considered, technically speaking, a remnant. Yeah. So there are applications of the word, right? So we understand that. What is it, though? The word itself, what does it mean? Okay. That which is left over, or that which remains, right? So, the remnant is that which remains when the rest is used up, is kind of the idea. This goes to what we talked about last week, I do believe. When we started our discussion in chapter 9, Paul starts his discussion in chapter 9, and what does he have to say about people in Israel? Anybody remember? Okay, not everybody who is physically descended from Israel are going to be considered the children of promise, right? You know, are going to be considered of that line from Abraham. And we saw that's the case. Isaac and Ishmael, only one of them, right? Jacob and Esau, only one of them. That's a pattern that's established. Why would anyone assume then that everybody who has the blood of Jacob flowing through them are just automatically children of promise? In fact, it's those who are descended by what? Not by blood, but by faith, right? those who are descended by faith, who are the children of promise. So, what we have then is a remnant. And so, the picture is you kind of have the whole, and throughout time, this is the picture that comes, that you have the smaller part, the remnant, who are the faithful. Everybody here is in a covenant relationship with God, right? Through the law of Moses. Throughout, I'm talking about in the time of the prophets, when all of this is written, everybody in this big circle, which is Israel, everybody here is in a covenantal relationship with God, but that doesn't mean that everybody is acting faithful to that covenant. And so it talks about a remnant. That is, those who choose to be faithful to God, who are going to be the ones that when judgment comes and all of this is going to be done away, it's the remnant who will remain. That's the picture. That's the idea. And judgment itself, remember, is never the end of the story, because there's always the remnant through which the story continues. Judgment is never the end. God brings his judgment, but it's not the end of the story, because there's always a remnant by which the story continues. And so this idea of the remnant from the prophets and such, which is all over the place, Paul takes that, just the way that he took the analogy of the potter, and brings them up into this scenario, and he says, yeah, you've got all of Israel, but is all of Israel faithful? All right, they may be faithful to what? All right. They may be faithful to the law, but they're not faithful to God through Christ. Does that make sense? That's the distinction that we're getting at in Romans. There's the works of the law versus faith in Christ. And so the Messiah, the one sent by God, the anointed one, the King, he has been rejected. Let's see here, verse 27, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel are as the sand of the sea, only a remnant will be saved, for the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. And then as Isaiah predicted, the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom, and we would have been like Gomorrah. Verse 30, what shall we say then? This is where it gets interesting. Because when you see that phrase, what shall we say then? Or what then? Typically speaking, what is Paul doing? All right, Josie nailed it. That's exactly right. She said the imaginary objector. Usually with this phrase, Paul is bringing up the imaginary objector. What shall we say then? Shall we continue to sin so that grace may increase? Right? What shall we say then? What then? When you see this, he's saying this is the objection that people had, and almost without fail, it's followed by what? God forbid. Of course not. That would be ridiculous, right? The strong negation that you find, that meganoita, of course, there's no way, right? Is that here? It's not. In other words, he's now, I think, quoting our imaginary objector. And our imaginary objector at this point would say, what? The Gentiles who didn't pursue righteousness get it? But Israel, who pursues a law that would lead to righteousness, don't get it? And they would say, that doesn't make any sense. And what does Paul say? Well, just in general right here, he says, yes, you are absolutely right. He's not trying, this is not an objection that he's going to try to work around. He's not trying to get them to see reason. He's not saying, no, you're not being fair. That's not what I said. That's not what I mean. Yeah. He just says, yeah, nailed it. You are absolutely right that Gentiles who have been living off in whatever fantasy world without the God of all creation for all of this time, and they haven't been a part of it, they've never been given the law, they don't understand all of this, and then one day fingers get snapped and they get a relationship and they become righteous even though they have absolutely zero history with God. Yes, that's exactly what happens. And yet you have the Jews who were raised up and given this elevated position. They're the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're the children of Israel, and they were kept throughout the slavery in Egypt and brought out by Moses, and they saw God on the mountain, and the mountain quaked, and they entered into a covenant. They were carried through the Red Sea on dry ground. They were given the land, and they were upheld by God for 1,500 years, and the Messiah comes into the world through them, and by and large, they're going to be rejected by God and not become righteous? Yes, Paul says. That is absolutely right. That is what is happening. Because, somebody said this earlier, I think it might have been Ryan, I think that I heard, but verse 3, being ignorant of the righteousness of God, seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. They didn't pursue it by what? All right, I think that's what I heard Ryan say. They didn't pursue it by faith. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Well, that's a loaded phrase, right? What does that mean? And you guys, for those of you who take the time to read through what I prepare beforehand so that you'll do a better job at the read Chris's mind game, some of you guys like to do that. I'm assuming. You're at a disadvantage because this is part of what is in the back right now that just got put back there tonight before class, so you have not had a chance to read it. And so it's going to make read Chris's mind a whole lot more difficult because you haven't seen it yet, but what does this mean? Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. This is chapter 9. I'm sorry, where we just moved. Let's see here. We moved into chapter 10 and verse 4. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. This section, my section in my head starts at chapter 9 and verse 30. And then runs through chapter 10, probably 10:4 for this section. So anything that I was saying from verse 30 through 10:4 is kind of all one chunk, and it's fair game in my mind. But if you see the chapter break there, that kind of, it's just one of those things that when you see it, it's hard to think past it. So yes. I'm still in the chapter 9, verse 30 section, but I'm down in chapter 10 and verse 4. So what does that mean? Okay, I'm sorry, Connie, what'd you say? Okay, that is one take. Can I erase up here? Are we y'all okay? Everybody? Okay. So, that Jesus brings about the end of the law of Moses. Okay? We're going to talk about all of these. And I have 3 in my head potentials. And maybe some of you all will surprise me with a 4th or a 5th. I'm not sure. But what do y'all think? Very good, Connie. Thank you. I don't know if I said that or not, but thank you. Yeah, Ryan?
Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Culmination, to me, kind of brings the picture of maybe a climax.
Okay. All right.
So he is the pinnacle of what the law was trying to teach about.
All right. All right. So, I think that's one of the ones that I have. Maybe worded a little bit differently, but yeah. I think that's very good. One more. Unless you say one I don't have, and then we'll have 2 more. You still haven't actually thrown out the way that this is usually understood. So, that's good, because I don't think it's usually understood properly. All right, for the sake of time, let me give you number 3. There is no more law. Now that you have Christ and grace, that means that law is no longer necessary. Does that make sense? All right, so let's talk about these in the order that I want to talk about them. Let's start with that number 3, the idea that there is now no more law. Because now, I mean, isn't that how chapter 8 began? There's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So, okay. All right, so Jan was saying that the context there, as you continue past verse 1 in chapter 8, there are actually 3 laws that are under discussion. There is the law of sin and death, which is the one that we're freed from, the law of Moses, which cannot free us, but there's also the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus, which does free us and is called a law. So, yes, that is accurate. But they would also say that, well, yeah, it may be called a law, but it's not really a law because it's grace. And grace is on one side, law is on the other. They are diametrically opposed, mutually exclusive. If you have grace, then you could no longer have law. And this is a fairly common way of understanding this, that because of grace, that puts the end to any need for a law, because your sins are covered, right? If your violation of law is no longer a violation of law, then what law could there be? And this is usually when we understand that Romans is a comparison of what 2 things? Yeah, faith and works. So if Romans is a comparison of faith and works, that's what Dave said, then this makes a whole lot of sense. That you no longer have to work for anything. There's no law. There's nothing there. Just faith. When you put it in the proper context that we've been placing this in, I don't think this makes sense. I think Jan's pushback. Makes a whole lot of sense. There are the 3 laws that are under discussion. Just because we have been brought out of the law of sin and death, is the law of sin and death still there? Yeah, he did not bring an end to the law of sin and death. And even Paul's own writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, when he says, to those who are under the law, I become as one who's under the law, but those who are not under the law, I also become as one not under the law. But then what does he go on to say after that? Anybody remember? Something to the effect of, and I'm not going to quote this, I'm sure well, but he goes on then after that to say, though still, not that I am not under a law, I'm still under the law of Christ. In other words, he's saying, yeah, I don't live as if I'm under the law of Moses, but that doesn't mean that I can just do anything that I want to. I'm still bound by a law of Christ, by which, can I just go around sinning willy-nilly, doing anything that I want to do? No. Law is still there. It's still in effect. The law of sin and death is still in effect. All right. So, I don't think that's a good one. These 2, I think, are better options. I want to go with the end of the law of Moses itself, that he puts an end to the law. And there's a sense in which you may be able to meld these together to some degree, depending how you mean the end of the law of Moses. But when people usually refer to this, what they mean is this puts an end to the ability for the law of Moses to provide righteousness. That up to the point that Jesus arrives on the scene, people's righteousness up to that point is based on what? How well they follow the law. And so, the Israelites and everybody else, they had to live based on the law that was given to them, right? They have to live based on that law, and how well they follow that law will determine their righteous standing before God. But then when Christ comes, and usually the argument from here goes from a misreading, I think, of Colossians 2, where they say that what was nailed to the cross? The law of Moses, right? Which is not what Colossians 2 actually says. There's nowhere that talks about the law of Moses being nailed to the cross. He did not come and effectively put an end to the law of Moses. In fact, the law of Moses itself continues after the cross, does it not? And it continues in the exact same way that it was in place before, and it continues in that exact same way afterwards. Nothing at all changes until what point in time? All right, until AD 70. And AD 70, temple's destroyed, Judaism's out, and all of that is done away with. Does that make sense? Until then, the law of Moses doesn't change. It doesn't go away. It's exactly what it was before and after the cross, because it's very specific to whom? The Jewish people. It's their law and only their law. And was it mutually exclusive with Christianity? No, right? Some Jews maybe tried to, but doesn't Paul himself go through rites and rituals of the law of Moses? Doesn't he have Timothy circumcised? Didn't we just refer just a minute ago that when he says that he's around those who are under the law, what does he become? As one who is under the law. Because it's just as much a thing at this point as it was beforehand. It doesn't go away, and it's not mutually exclusive with Christianity. We see that point in Acts chapter 21. Yeah, Kevin? Do you need a microphone? Because it's... Oh, okay, there we go. You're good.
I guess with your point about Paul putting himself under the law for whatever the circumstance that he was in, I would say the one part of that law that he didn't put himself under was that Christ didn't die. That Christ's sacrifice had happened, and that the law, for its ability to have any importance towards being righteous in God's eyes, was not something he put himself back under the law regarding. Maybe the ceremonies and different ways of doing things. Is that a proper look at it, or do you think that the law and Christ's sacrifice could be on the same level at this point, in between this time and AD 70, if you say, well, that's when it all ended for the Jews practicing the Jewish customs and ability to trace their lineage?
Yeah, but that's Paul's point that he's been making throughout, is that the law never had anything to do with their righteousness before God, that it wasn't a part of it.
The question is here in 10:4, I guess, and looking at this for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to be a little bit confused about to everyone that believes. So what are you saying about that again? You have to repeat it. I guess I'm slow of hearing.
Yeah, we'll get to number 2 in just a second.
Okay, well, I guess I'm ahead of you in that regard. But I guess my point towards where Paul was when we talk about him being as those who were under the law in whatever circumstances, to what degree that would look like. I mean, I can visualize it in being like towards the customs and maybe how they talked and working with them through this transition period, let's just say that. But I guess I have a problem with him if it's to say that it's further than that somehow Christ's sacrifice wasn't, and Jesus Christ wasn't put in the right perspective to the things we've talked about with the Jews limiting Christ's preeminence and how the Gentiles can be saved.
Yeah, that's the unfaithful. I mean, they may have seen it that way, but Paul clearly puts the law of Moses in its proper perspective, and it has nothing at all to do with their righteousness before God. It has everything to do with their being part of a people who were put in a special place, which doesn't change. And in Acts chapter 21, remember when Paul came into Jerusalem and James said, Paul, we've got a problem here. People are going around saying that you are telling Jews to stop following the law of Moses. And then James goes on to say, to prove that's not true, do this. And what Paul does not say at that moment is, no, James, that's exactly what I'm doing. Because you need to stop following the law of Moses. Do we need to have a seminar on what the law of Moses is? No, all he does is say, okay. And he does. He goes, he follows things of the law of Moses, purification. He kept a vow, sacrifices are done. All kinds of things are a part of it. Paul has no problem with that because Paul understands that the law of Moses has never had a place as far as your righteousness before God is concerned on an individual level, and it never will have a place. Only Jesus the Christ has that place. Now, to Kevin's point, if there is anybody who elevates the law of Moses to the same level, to the same efficacy of salvation that Jesus has, then Paul is very clear and very adamant that when you compare the two, when you have Christ and the power of the resurrection on one hand, and you have the greatest that the law could possibly have on the other in Philippians chapter 3, when you compare the two, what is the law? It's excrement, right? I mean, he makes it very clear. There is no, and this is what I think Kevin's trying to stress right here, there is no place at any point in any time in Paul's mindset and any of these Christians who were Jews and Christians at the same time where they ever said these two things are equal. And when they tried to, you get the letter of Hebrews, right? Which goes in and says, no, you are mistaken. And so we need to make sure that we put it in that perspective. But it doesn't mean that when you became a Christian, you were supposed to stop being a Jew, or you were supposed to stop doing the things of the Jews, or various things. They're not mutually exclusive. You just have to, and again, I appreciate Kevin stressing this, you just have to make sure that you understand what is what. Christ has to do with your salvation and relationship and righteousness before God. The law, that's just you continuing to be a part of a people that really only have 70 more years. All right, very quickly, I want to talk about this. The word here is end, right? It's the word for end. And, you know, I think I want to go to what Ryan is saying, the idea of climax here. There is a story arc, is there not? A narrative that flows from the time of Abraham. You can say all the way back to Genesis 3 and the seed promise. But the story that flows, and it flows through the people who were kept very separate and particular for the purpose, right? For the purpose of bringing about the Messiah. When he comes, that purpose is fulfilled. And what does he bring with him? What is the end result of the law of Moses? What's that end point of it? It's right there in the verse, right? Christ is the end of the law for what? For righteousness. That the law of Moses does not provide righteousness. Never has provided righteousness, but what it does, the law and the prophets, they have a path that leads to Jesus. And when you get to Jesus, he is that climactic point. I like that word that Ryan used, the climax. He's that climactic point. He's the climax of everything in the law and the prophets. And when you get to him, the law and the prophets, their purpose before God ends with the Messiah. Now, the law keeps on going, but its purpose has been completed, which is why I think you've got a generation, right? 40 years. In 40 years from AD 30 to AD 70, they're given a generation to transition. I think Kevin used that word a minute ago. I like that word. To transition and make that transition, and then it's gone. There is no more law of Moses at that point. It's finished. And so Jesus becomes the ending point of the law and the prophets, and the result at the end is righteousness. Does that make sense? So at least, Kevin, does that make sense? At least the way that I see the word end there? A little different of a nuance. So, all right. And by the way, Kevin, thank you. I don't know if I said thank you, but that was a very, very good objection. I appreciate you bringing that up. All right. We got to end. I'm over time by a couple minutes, so no more questions or anything. But thanks a lot, guys. It was a good class. And we'll don't forget there are handouts at the back for the rest of chapter 10, and we should be able to get through a lot of that next week. All right. Thanks a lot.